Shalom Aleichem, welcome back to the Clinical Halacha series where we discuss many common, recent, important medical innovations, medical discussions, and view them through the lens of the Messiah, through the lens of Halacha. Today, we're going to discuss one of the most amazing technological breakthroughs of the past 50 years, and that has led to numerous couples being able to have children, and numerous children, grandchildren, and perhaps now even great-grandchildren who are in this world only because of this most amazing technology, which of course many of you are probably aware of where we're going. It is in vitro fertilization. IVF is the most common and effective type of ART, assistive reproductive technology. It involves fertilizing a woman's eggs with the zera in a laboratory dish before you transfer that embryo into the uterus to establish pregnancy. It's interesting that the first successful human IVF birth occurred in England in July 25th in 1978. It was by somebody whose name was Louise Joy Brown in Oldham, England, and the professors and doctors who performed this IVF in 2010, Be'erech, they actually won the Nobel Prize for this most amazing technology. It's just interesting, if you look back historically, in the 1890s, there was already a professor who began the first step towards successful IVF. His name was Professor Walter Heap. Now, of course, he wasn't doing IVF in 1890, but what he was able to do was take an embryo from an animal, I believe it was a rabbit, and he successfully moved over that embryo to another rabbit, which eventually led to further and further testing, and eventually that led to the production and the creation and the perfection of the technology which we call IVF. So let's just discuss some of the medical inyanim before we get into the halacha of in vitro fertilization. So we use IVF to overcome various causes of infertility, which allows couples in order to be able to build their families. Now, when is IVF required? So often there are tubal factors. You could have blocked or damaged fallopian tubes. You can have male infertility, where the count of the zera is poor or the motility is not sufficient. You can have endometriosis or ovulatory disorders because of that severe tissue growth. So implantation is often going to be a problem. Sometimes we just have unexplained infertility. We don't know why people are unable to have children, but sometimes just through IVF alone, they are able to be successful. Typically, IVF is a 5-step process. A full cycle takes about 3 to 4 weeks, and there are 5 main phases. First is ovarian stimulation. The woman will take a daily hormone about 8 to 14 days before to stimulate the production of multiple mature eggs, as opposed to just one egg, which is how the natural cycle would produce. Second of all, you have to retrieve the egg, which is a minor surgical procedure. It's an ultrasound-guided aspiration needle, and they retrieve the egg. Of course, then they do insemination and fertilization, where in a sterile Petri dish, they put them together, and it's either standard mixing or ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where one is going into each egg. That's for different cases if you need such specific focus. Then you have, of course, the embryo culture, where you watch them in a lab for 3 to 7 days. They develop, they divide, and at a certain point of division, they place it into the uterus using a thin catheter, and often the other embryos, they'll put them into cryopreservation for future attempts. So that is the medical process. Again, perfected successfully in 1978. Of course, the technology has gotten better and better. 5 primary steps for a bunch of reasons. The question, though, is how does halacha view this concept, this process of IVF? So it's important to make a very important note, and that is today it has become accepted in Dalet Kanafai Sa'aretz in all corners of the halacha world, the B'nai Torah, everybody accepts IVF as an appropriate approach to procreation. However, when it came out initially, there was some controversy. So we're going to go revisit what the previous controversy was, and then we'll see how the Gedolei Ha'achrayim, the major Baalei Mesorah, were matir, encouraged IVF, and that seems to be the Mesorah in Dalet Kanafai Sa'aretz. The Tzitz Eliezer in Tesvav Mem Hey, who was the Rav of Shaarei Tzedek, Rav Waldenberg, who wrote many of the foundational tshuvas in medicine. He was asked this question by the CEO of the hospital in 1980. And he was asked, there's this new technology, it just came out. It was about 2.5 years after the first successful IVF, and the question was whether we should bring this into Shari Tzedek as a option for couples who are suffering from infertility. And it's interesting that Tzitz Eliezer was very strongly against this IVF process, and he had many, many problems. He had questions of lineage, questions of Zer Levatala, putting seed to waste. He had problems of Peru Revu, are you Mekayim the mitzvah of procreation? And he says at the end of his tshuva, which is a very long tshuva, La'or kol ha'omer b'dvareinu arkoi, after all that I've written, Nira lanias daiti lahalacha de'ein lahatir b'shum panim. Absolutely not. That's hafraya hamalachtes b'mevchana, which is IVF. So that is how the Tzitz Eliezer established his approach to IVF. But if you look at many, many, many of the Gedolei HaPoskim, our Balei Mesorah, they seem to take a different approach. If you look at the Baal Shevet HaLevi, Shmuel Vosner, who was of the major Poskim of Bnei Brak of the past 50 or so years, very close with the Chazon Ish and many of the other Gedolim of yesteryear. So he says, I want to make a proclamation. This is in the Sefer Pua, which is one of the organizations. They put out a lot of halacha. It's in Chelek Beis Pei Zayin. Hareini bezelagalis datenu das Torah. I want to convey das Torah. What is the approach to halacha in this aspect? She'elu shelo yizachu lehipaked bezer shekayama b'derech ragil. They're unable to have regular children. So what is the approach to halacha? It says like this: absolutely al pi Torah yichus hayiladim hanal lehareim kebitay ubnei lechol davar. First of all, these are definitely their children according to halacha. There's no lineage issues. The mother's the mother, the father's the father, as relates to inheritance, to aliyahs, kurva, everything. And umakayim b'zeh Mrs. Perivaribia, and they get Peru Revu, and they can do Mila on the 8th day, and there's absolutely no question. This is totally, totally, totally within the line of halacha, and there is not a halachic issue with performing it. And at the end, they bring it that they showed this letter to Rav Elyashiv, who was the poskim of the previous 100 years, and Rav Elyashiv says, I add my affirmation to the words of my close friend, Rav Vosner, and absolutely, bli shum pikbuk. V'hanini mitzdarif l'divrei yedidi hagayin habezdin the Zirchan Meir, which is the Rav Vosner, limchais b'miv shemaitzi laz al tetzam elu, to protest those who are protesting, those who are slandering, those who engage in IVF. Asher kshem lavei b'kal Hashem bli shum pikbuk. There is no question. Now, those are some fighting words from Rav Elyashiv. Usually, we don't always see such strong l'shtoinus from Rav Elyashiv. Here he says, b'li shom pikbuk, meaning there's no question at all. That which the Tzitz Eliezer raises the Indian Peru Revu, that which he raises the Indian Yichus. So all of the Achronim here say these are not issues, the halacha, that we feel are problematic issues. So that is definitely the Mahalach, that's the Mesorah, that we definitely engage, we encourage in cases where it's appropriate, in vitro fertilization. However, what the poskim do raise is this something you can do as many times as you want? Or perhaps once someone was already Mekayim Peru Revu, so then you shouldn't do it again. And one of the major questions is that often some of the zera, some of the seed gets wasted because you don't use all of it. So there is potentially a shaila of some zera levatala. So do we weigh that concept and allow us to do as many times as is necessary, or maybe only until one is Mekayim the mitzvah of Peru Revu? That's a machlekes achreinim. If you look at the Shevet HaLevi, the same Rav Vosner that we just saw a few minutes ago, who discussed the absolute, no question, permissibility of IVF and its children, its Peru Revu, it's absolutely a normal child in all aspects of halacha, but he does say we should limit this heter only until one has Mekayim Peru Revu. Beyond the mitzvah of Peru Revu, he feels it's not kedai to keeping Soma because there are some kulas that we need. Mikamakum yira lahagbil hadavar rak lemitzvahs Peru Revu bilvad, v'nir dezeha yadas kogbeli shenasu v'nasnu b'nidoin zeh. But if you look at Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Yin Chashlema in Gimel Kuf Gimel Ois Tes Zayin, he says, I disagree. And even though there's potentially a shaila of Zera Levatola, that's only if you're wasting the seed. But here we're using it with the purpose of having more children. The mitzvah of procreating the world, which is the mitzvah derabanan, as opposed to the mitzvah deraisa of Peru Revu. The man or the woman are in a lot of pain that they don't have more children. So we discuss the medical process again, successfully done in 1978 for a bunch of infertility factors, tubal infertility, endometriosis, or genetic preservation. We discussed the 5 steps: stimulation, retrieval, fertilization, embryo culture, and implantation and transfer. And then we discussed the halacha, even though the Tzitz Eliezer, who was probably the first Achrein asked about IVF, was very against it. Rav Wosner, the Rav Yashiv, the Minchas Yitzchak, Rosh Hashanah, they all are very clear that it's absolutely something that doesn't have any pickbook in halacha. But the Shevet Levi and Rosh Hashanah do have a machlekes. Do we allow this with a carte blanche out there, as many as you want, which seems to be the shita of Rosh Hashanah, if there's a need to have more, even if you already mekayim the mitzvah? And the Shevet Levi says no. Rav Wosner says we limit it only to the mitzvah of Perut Revu. We will do a corollary to this next time, the idea of PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which discusses, are we allowed to test the embryos for genetic issues? That we will see next week. Emir Hashem, thank you for joining. Hope it was informative, both medically and halacha. And always remember, we look at the Gedolei Achreinim, the Balei Yesara, those who carry the tradition, for how we approached new medical technologies in the lens of halacha.